this lecture, we're going to consider how we measure the concepts or phenomena that we plan to observe during our data collection. Now, to illustrate why that's important, I want you to imagine that I've taken a deck of cards and dealt you a random hand. And let's say you got the following 6 cards: the 2 of clubs, the 6 of hearts, the 6 of clubs, the 7 of spades, the 9 of spades, and the 10 of hearts. So let's play a game. Take those 6 cards and in 2 minutes, find as many ways as possible of creating arrangements of card groups. And the only rules are these. A group consists of at least 2 cards. To count, an arrangement has to have at least 2 groups, and every card must be in one group for the arrangement to count, so no leftover cards. So for example, you could group those 6 cards by suit with 2 clubs, 2 hearts, and 2 spades. That's an arrangement with 3 groups of cards with 2 cards in each group, so that would count as one arrangement. How many arrangements do you think you could come up with in 2 minutes? Well, here are the ones that I came up with pretty quickly. You could arrange the cards by suit: clubs, hearts, and spades. I have 2 cards in each group in that arrangement. But how about by color? Hearts are red, and spades and clubs are black, so I have 2 red and 4 black. And we also have odd and even numbered cards, 2 odd and 4 even. Now, those are pretty easy, but how about these? Cards with the value of 6 and below versus cards above 6. That meets our rules. So do 7s and below versus 7s and above, for that matter. What about 6s and not 6s? There are 2 cards with the value of 6 and 4 with the value of not 6. There's also clubs and not clubs, hearts and not hearts, and spades and not spades. You could even do prime numbers and not prime numbers, or numbers divisible and not divisible by 3. So there are actually quite a lot of ways we can arrange these cards into groups. That same information, the 6 cards, can be organized and defined in more than a dozen ways, depending on how you view them and categorize them. So what does all this have to do with measurement? Well, let's take a look at what is meant by that term. Measurement is how we observe and catalog information about our concepts of interest and assign them numbers, symbols, definitions, and other meanings. Now, when I use the word measure, you probably think of a ruler or measuring tape, and that's not wrong. These are tools that we use to give us information about a concept of interest, such as length, width, or height, that we then assign numbers to. So if I want to know how tall my nephew is, I'll take out the tape measure and record his height in inches. The tape measure is the tool, the concept of interest is height, and the recording unit is inches. Unless, of course, we lived outside the United States, where it might be centimeters. But measurement, as we use the term in research, can go well beyond using tape measures and rulers. Imagine you are buying a car, and you want to buy the safest car on the market. So you go to a dealership and ask them how safe their latest model is. Now, since they're in the business of selling cars, they're going to fall all over themselves to tell you how safe their car is. We have anti-lock brakes, tire pressure monitoring, airbags, side airbags, and a 5-star safety rating. That sounds like a lot of safety features. But then you go to the next dealership and they're telling you about traction control and parking assist and electronic stability control. And they too have this mysterious 5-star rating, but for a different combination of features. And then you go to a third place, which doesn't have most of those specialized systems, but which will sell you a heavier car. And they say that the weight of the car is more important than anything else when it comes to safety. So which car is the safest? Now, I'm no car expert, so I don't have a ready answer to that question, but I can tell you how to go about finding an answer. To start, I want you to think about how we define words like safe in the context of a car. What does that mean conceptually? One definition might be that a safe car is one that minimizes the chances of death or extreme injury in an accident. Another is that a safe car is one that is less likely to get into an accident in the first place. Now, of course, there are others, but let's consider these two for now. The definition of safe matters a lot because different car features aim at different definitions of safety. So take seatbelts. A seatbelt is designed to minimize injury in the event of an accident, but it won't help you avoid an accident. In fact, some studies have shown that seatbelts present a moral hazard problem, that drivers wearing seatbelts might drive more recklessly and get into more accidents because the danger of injury in an accident is reduced. Similarly, a backup camera isn't going to help you once an accident starts, but it might help you avoid an accident by improving your view of cars behind you while reversing. The point is, how we define our concept of safety matters, and that even without a ruler or measuring tape, we can create a set of indicators that allow us to observe different cars and compare them in terms of how safe they are. We could, for example, create a list of all safety features and observe how many each car has, and then declare the one with the most the safest. Or we could determine a list of features that, if present, denote a car as safe, and then observe which ones meet that threshold. Or we could skip that step altogether and go straight to statistics. We could look at the record of each car model and see the percentage of accidents or accident-related deaths that occur in those cars compared to the number of those cars on the road. Armed with any of this information, we could make an informed, safe car buying decision. But without measurement, we can't do any of that. Measurement is what takes us from vague and subjective feelings about a concept to something concrete and objective that invites comparison. It's what lets us go from "this car feels safe" based on vague impressions to "this car has the best safety record on the market" based both on the number of relevant safety features and its accident record. Okay, so if measurement is that process of assigning numbers, symbols, and definitions to our concepts and variables of interest, we need to know how to go about doing that. Step number 1 is conceptually define your variable of interest. Now, a variable is a characteristic of a unit or concept that varies in value or category. So conceptualizing your variables requires you to develop a clear definition of your concept. This is important because some concepts have multiple meanings, and we want to be transparent about what exactly we mean. We've already talked about the multiple meanings of car safety. Let's consider a different example. Health. What does it mean to be healthy? Now, one definition might be that a healthy person does not have a disease. The first definition in Merriam-Webster dictionary for healthy states, quote, "free of disease," end quote. But that's not very satisfying. Someone might not have a disease right now, but they may have a number of risk factors for disease. Other people might technically have a disease, but wouldn't really be considered unhealthy. Have you ever had a cold sore? You probably have. 90% of Americans have one at some point in their life. If you do, you probably have a virus, herpes simplex virus or HSV. Should all of us be considered unhealthy on this basis? And that's just considering physical health. What about emotional or mental health? If those aren't part of our definition, then our study will just focus on physical health, which might be considered an incomplete picture of overall health. I hope you see that it's really important to think through our definitions before we ever start looking for data. So how do we do this? Well, one place to start is the dictionary. If your variable is a general term like healthy or safety, it can be useful to understand how the term is used in general practice so you can refine your own thoughts. Now from there, you probably want to dive into the literature on your topic to see how scholars before you have defined the variable. Now this is useful for a couple of reasons. First, it can really save you some time. If you come up with your own definition, you're going to have to really refine it and defend it. If your definition isn't sound, your entire project will unravel, just as if you define health only as not physically diseased. If it's based on what other scholars have published, you can cite them. You'll still have to defend your choice, but you will have more evidence on your side. You may also find out that there's a conventional and widely accepted definition for your concept, in which case you can simply cite it and move on, so long as that definition fits your understanding and need for the concept. Now, if there aren't already clear conceptual definitions for your topic, that's okay. Developing a new and compelling definition for a concept can be a scientific contribution in its own right. Let's move on to step number 2. Operationalize your variables. Now, operationalizing a variable means determining what indicators we'll look for to show us where our subject under study falls on that variable. It's simply the observable markers that we look for to help us assess and then categorize our subjects. In the case of healthy, this would mean the indicators we will evaluate to determine whether one person is healthy and another person not healthy. In terms of car safety, these are the factors we examine to classify one car as safe and another as not safe. As with many aspects of research design, this isn't optional. You can't skip this step and just decide to figure it out later. Remember, our job is to be systematic, neutral, and replicable. If you don't start with clear rules on how to observe your concepts, you're very likely going to be biased toward finding the results you want and ignoring those you don't. This is something we see all the time in partisan political behavior. The same behaviors by politicians, flip-flopping on positions, or say, engaging in poor cybersecurity behavior, are rarely evaluated objectively by their supporters. Instead, if the person is in our political party or group, we might defend, minimize, or dismiss the behavior while attacking a political opponent for something similar. Now, that may make for entertaining politics, but it's a lousy way to go about doing empirical research. Finally, keep in mind that we want to be transparent so that our work can be replicated. For that, we need clear procedures, including procedures on how we will measure and observe our variables. If your procedures aren't clear, there's no way for me to replicate your results. So how do we go about operationalizing a variable? Well, the first step is to figure out what the possible observable indicators are of your variable. Using the definition that you created, consider how we would observe the incidence or absence of that variable in the real world. What kinds of behaviors or evidence would tell us about this characteristic of a subject? Consider the variable health. Let's say for a second that we decided to conceptually define this as disease-free. Yes, I know we discussed why that's not a great definition, but just go with me on this for a second. What kinds of indicators would we look for to categorize our subjects as either diseased or disease-free? One option might be to operationalize diseased as a subject that reports being recently diagnosed with or treated for a disease by a doctor. That, however, would omit people who may have a disease but aren't seeking treatment, maybe because they don't know about it or because they can't afford medical care. Instead, we could try a different operationalization, such as a subject that reports experiencing chronic pain or lack of regular full body function due to a physical ailment. That would capture the people who haven't seen a doctor, but it might also capture people with long-term joint pain due to an old knee injury, not exactly someone we might call diseased, and it would preclude anyone suffering from mental health disease. The point, though, is that both of these are operationalized definitions of our concept. In each case, they'll allow us to gather data about our subjects who we could then categorize into groups by our variable of interest, health. The next thing we have to do is determine how many categories we want within a given variable and what those categories should be. So far, for healthy, we've been using unhealthy and healthy. There are only 2 options there, but we could instead use a wider and more precise set of categories, perhaps a 5-point scale of very unhealthy to very healthy, with a neither healthy nor unhealthy option in the middle. These categories within the variable are often called values. Part of the operationalization process is determining what the theoretical range of values will be for your variables. Imagine you walk into a child's playroom and it's filled with toys all over the floor. Along one wall are a series of unlabeled toy boxes, and you need to come up with a system to organize the toys and then label the boxes. What do you do? Well, one option could be to organize the toys by age of the child. One box could be labeled infant, another toddler, and a third preschooler. Or you could organize by color, one box for blue toys, another for red toys, and a third for black toys. Or you could organize by function, with a box for building toys, another for dolls, and a third for art supplies. Your organization method, age of the child, color, or function, that's the variable. The labels on the toy boxes, those are your values. Now, one important thing to keep in mind when determining your values is how precise you want them to be. Earlier, I said I wanted to measure my nephew's height. I could record his height in inches, which would be very precise. But I could instead simply use the categories of tall and short and select a threshold to act as the cutoff between the two. Now, tall and short is a low level of precision, while the exact number of inches is a much higher level of precision. Sometimes you want a higher level of precision, other times it's not necessary, or it might even distort your data if you use values that are too precise. We actually have 4 main levels of measurement. In order from least precise to most precise, they are nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. The nominal level of measurement simply means we have a difference between at least 2 values within the variable. But we can't rank the values or order them in a meaningful way. A simple list of colors would be at the nominal level of measurement. The colors differ from each other, but one isn't more color than another, they just differ from each other. What about if there's no difference between the values? Well, in that case, we don't have a variable anymore, we have a constant. A constant is a characteristic where there is no variation. Every subject has the same value. Now, a good example of a nominal measure is marital status. As we've previously discussed, the values of this variable are typically single, married, divorced, and widowed, although sometimes you see more categories included, such as separated or partnered. Note that these are all different categories of marital status, but we can't order them in a meaningful way. Is divorced more or less marital status than widowed? That doesn't make sense, which is why this measure and others like it, such as race, ethnicity, nationality, or religious denomination, tend to be at the nominal level of measurement. They're just different categories, with no one value higher or lower than any other. The next level is ordinal measures. Now, at this level, we still have the difference between categories, but we gain the ability to rank order them. We can clearly define a highest and lowest, or tallest and shortest, or youngest and oldest, and put all the values in order along the spectrum. We can't yet define distances between these categories, but we know who came in first and who came in last. And this is more precise than nominal measures. Age can be defined at the ordinal level. If we put people into categories such as child, young adult, adult, and senior, we're using a ranking system. Another example would be your university year, freshman, sophomore, junior, and senior. Or think about officer ranks in the armed services. In all of these cases, we can rank the different values in a meaningful way. Our next level is the interval level of measurement. Here, we have the difference between categories from nominal measures and the ranking we get from ordinal measures, but we add the ability to define distances between categories. A variable at the interval level lets us clearly measure how far it is between one value and the next. Unlike nominal and ordinal, it requires numbers. The classic example of an interval measure is temperature. We know that 70 degrees is different from 40 degrees, a difference between categories. We also can rank it against other values of temperature. We know, for example, that 70 degrees is greater than 40 degrees and less than 80 degrees. But now we can say something more. We can note that 70 degrees is 30 degrees more than 40 degrees. So now we can clearly measure the distance between two values along the same variable. We couldn't do that with our ordinal measure of age. What's the numerical difference between child, young adult, and adult? The categories are less precise, and we can't define a numerical distance between them. We can determine age at the interval level. Consider the year of birth. We can say that someone born in 1960 has a different year of birth from someone born in 1980. We can also rank those two categories and say that the person born in 1960 is older than the person born in 1980. We gain one more piece of information, though. We can say that the person born in 1960 is 20 years older than the person born in 1980. Being able to quantify that distance is that added level of precision that puts us at the interval level of measurement. Ratio, our final level of measurement, adds a subtle layer of precision to variables at the interval level. At the ratio level of measurement, we introduce to our variable a true zero and the idea of the absence of the characteristic. Zero is meaningful in a ratio measure. It indicates the absence of whatever it is that we're measuring, which enables us to talk about two subjects in ratio to each other. Let's illustrate this idea with an example. Consider the variable of income. Someone who makes $80,000 differs in income level from someone who makes $40,000, makes more than that person, and is separated from that person's income by a $40,000 difference. That covers our nominal, ordinal, and interval levels. But we can also say that the person who makes $80,000 makes twice as much as the person making $40,000. The idea of a $0 of income, is meaningful here. It means the absence of income. Compare that to temperature, where 0 degrees does not mean the absence of heat, even though it's pretty cold. Or birth year, where being born in year 0 doesn't mean the absence of birth or age. So why use one level of measurement versus another? Well, there are a lot of reasons. The higher the level of measurement, the more precise the data, and the more statistical tests we can run, which is great. Another advantage to using a higher level of measurement is that if you gather very precise data, you can always later recategorize that data to a lower level of measurement. So if we're interested in height, we can precisely measure people now and then group them into less precise categories later. But if you only gather your data at a lower level of precision, you can never jump back up to a higher level of precision during the analysis stage. If my nephew is recorded only as tall, the only way to know his exact height in inches would be to go back into data collection and ask. So generally, it's better to get the more precise information first. At the same time, sometimes it's unnecessary or impractical to get more precise data. In the case of our marital status example, that data doesn't make sense at higher levels of measurement. And if I only need to know the heights of a bunch of 7-year-olds in order to put them in rows for a school picture, I might not need those heights in inches. Relative sizes such as tall and short will do. So as with everything else, your project will determine how precise your measures need to be. When all else is equal, though, you should generally aim to collect the most precise data you can. Before we finish our discussion of Step 2, operationalization, we need to talk about indexes. Remember earlier when we struggled to operationalize the variable healthy using the conceptual definition disease-free? We came up with two possible operationalized definitions, neither of which satisfied us. In this case, our conceptual definition was pretty flawed. But let's say that we like our conceptual definition. If you can't find a single high-quality operational definition, you have a couple of options. Option number 1 is to simply note you're keeping the scope of your study narrow and focusing only on this small group that you can readily observe. Science is incremental, so even a smaller contribution than originally planned can be valuable. You can always try a different operationalization in a later study if that will bring added value. Option number 2 is to use multiple operational definitions. This is actually quite common in research. It's pretty rare that a single indicator is going to completely and accurately capture our concept. So turning to multiple indicators lets us build a more robust set of criteria for our concept. One way to do this is to build an index. An index is when you take responses to multiple items measured on the same scale and combine them to produce a single number that can represent the subject on that variable. So take our example of health. We could just use a subject's single response to whether or not they've been diagnosed or treated with an illness to represent diseased or disease-free. Or we could design a series of, say, 5 yes-no questions. We could ask our subjects if they experience chronic pain or if they lack full regular physical body function. Subjects with 5 yeses could be classified as very unhealthy and 0 as very healthy. Many indexes are more sophisticated than this and use more advanced scales, but you get the idea. Using multiple indicators and building indexes can also help improve both reliability and validity, 2 key concepts that we will discuss momentarily. So, that's step 2. Step number 3 is evaluate reliability and validity. Let's look at reliability first. A reliable measure is a consistent measure. This means that the measure is going to give us a consistent result no matter how many times we employ it or who administers it. Imagine you step on a scale 5 times in the space of 1 minute. You don't change your clothes or eat anything in between. You stay exactly the same. But the scale's readings change. They come back as 110 pounds, 150 pounds, 200 pounds, 220 pounds, and 400 pounds. Would you trust this scale's measure of your weight? Of course not. It's clearly broken. Even if one of those was your true weight, we aren't getting a consistent, a reliable result. Well, the same thing goes for the measures we use in our research. We want our scale to consistently give the same results. That means 2 things. First, every time we employ the measure, assuming our subject itself hasn't changed, we should get the same result each time. Now, with inanimate objects, this can be relatively easy. A chemical is not going to protest or change its answer to a question. But if you're doing research on humans, you have to be prepared for deception, lying, refusals to answer, and other behaviors that might give you inconsistent results. We have to think about how to maximize consistency in our measures. Second, consistency can be an issue when multiple people are involved in the data collection. Let me give you 2 examples to help cement this idea for you. Have you ever heard of the Bible saying, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God? Now, there are a lot of possible explanations for this meaning of this somewhat odd statement. Why would a camel be trying to go through the eye of a needle? Some say that the needle's eye is the name of a narrow or treacherous mountain pass or gates to a city. Here's an alternate explanation. We know that the Bible was copied by hand for centuries before the advent of the printing press. Did you know that the difference between the word camel and rope in Greek is a single letter? And in Aramaic, the language Jesus would have spoken, the words for camel and rope are the same. If the reason why this saying discusses a camel rather than a rope going through the eye of a needle is that a scribe made a copying error, that's a problem of reliability. A second example comes from grading papers. All of us have probably experienced an unfair grade. A multiple choice test usually has very high reliability because there aren't any subjective measures to grade. But in an essay, the grading can be highly subjective. And if a professor grades a paper higher because it was the first in the stack, or it was early in the morning, or after petting a cat, that's an unreliable grading scheme. And if another professor using the same criteria would give it a different grade, that's also a reliability problem. Our second criteria for evaluation is validity. A valid measure is one that accurately and completely captures our concept. Now, validity has a higher threshold than reliability. A measure can be reliable without being valid, but it cannot be valid unless it is also reliable. Let's illustrate by returning to our scale example. Imagine that we have bought a new scale after our old one was such a disaster. And let's say that your true weight is 150 pounds. You weigh yourself 5 times on the new scale. The results come back as 200 pounds all 5 times. Is your scale reliable? Well, yes, it is consistently giving you the same result. But is your scale valid? No. The results may be consistently the same, but they're wrong. They are not an accurate reflection of our concept, your weight. If the scale gave us 5 different responses where only one was 150 pounds, the scale would be neither reliable nor valid. So for a measure to be valid, it must also be reliable, but a measure can be reliable without being valid. So therefore, we would say that reliability is necessary, but not sufficient for validity. There are lots of kinds of validity to consider, and we could spend hours just on this topic alone, so we're going to identify just a few. First, there's face validity. On the face of things, is your measure a good indicator of your concept? Imagine we used pet ownership as an indicator of good health. We might be able to stretch and think of a way to make it work, but on the face of it, it's not a good match for our concept. Then there's content validity, which assesses whether our measure completely captures all aspects of our concept. Remember earlier when we used disease-free as a measure of health? We questioned its content validity because it didn't completely capture all aspects of what we understand to be health. This is one reason why we often want multiple indicators of our concepts to maximize validity. Now, there are a number of other types of validity to consider, and there are tests you can use to ensure that your measures are reliable and valid. For now, however, it's important to give a lot of consideration to the measures that you choose and making sure that they accurately capture your concepts and variables of interest and that they can be measured in a consistent way. Coming up with good measures for abstract concepts can be pretty hard. Sometimes we just don't have good indicators for things we might want to observe, and many disciplines struggle with finding ways to measure concepts such as success or effectiveness. There are no perfect answers here. Look to the literature for ideas and remember to defend your decisions, and note that as a result, your claims about your findings may be limited. Remember, our goal is to make small, incremental advances. We'll find this is also the case when we pick our populations and samples, the next lesson in this course.